listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. As pressure mounts on the Trump administration, we investigate the bombshell allegations. Who's allegedly involved, the evidence of Australian survivor Virginia Giuffre, who died earlier this year in WA, and why there is growing speculation that jailed co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell, who's serving 20 years behind bars, will walk free after naming names. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Thursday, the 31st of July. The identity of a Sydney childcare worker charged with more than a dozen child sex abuse offences has been revealed. 26-year-old David James was charged by the Australian Federal Police in October last year, but a suppression order on his identity and ongoing investigations with the case were lifted today. It's believed more than 1,000 Sydney families have been contacted by authorities, with police discovering he had access to almost 60 different centres across the city. Here is a spokesperson with the Federal Police addressing the media earlier today.
This AFP investigation began in June 2024 after the detection of child abuse material on the dark web. A man was identified as being allegedly responsible for this material and a search warrant was executed at his Artarmon home in September 2024. We allege the man refused to provide access to his electronic devices and was charged and refused police bail. He was then granted bail by the courts 5 days later. AFP digital forensics investigators were able to crack into the man's devices and we found what we will allege is child abuse material. The man was rearrested in October 2024 and charged with 13 offences, including 9 counts of using a child to produce child abuse material.
James was also a former probationary constable before allegedly being sacked for failing to disclose his employment in the childcare industry. Melbourne's gangland war has erupted again with a 21-year-old man shot dead in Melbourne's outer north. Detectives allege 2 men were involved in an altercation in a laneway before someone opened fire just before 9 a.m. this morning. Police say the victim was known to police and the shooting appears to be very deliberate and targeted. And the family of Virginia Giuffre has spoken out after bizarre new allegations from Donald Trump. Earlier this week, the US president claimed Jeffrey Epstein had stolen Virginia from him after she worked at his Mar-a-Lago spa. Giuffre, who lived in Australia and died earlier this year in WA, was one of the most outspoken alleged victims of Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. In a statement to NBC News in America, her family says they were shocked by the president's comments, adding it makes us ask if he was aware of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal actions. We and the public are asking for answers. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with British-Australian journalist Lucia Osborne-Crowley. She was one of only 4 reporters in the court when Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years behind bars for her role as a co-conspirator with Jeffrey Epstein in what's now being seen as one of the biggest sex trafficking rings in history. And a warning that this discussion contains descriptions of child sex abuse. Lucia, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with a bit of a recap on the main players in this very disturbing controversy. Who was Jeffrey Epstein?
Thank you so much for having me. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier who managed money for a lot of very, very wealthy people. There are still a lot of questions about how he ran that business and how he made his own millions. But what we do know for sure about Jeffrey Epstein is that he ran the biggest sex trafficking ring in history. He groomed young girls and sexually abused them himself and also trafficked them to other people for the purposes of sexual abuse. So, as we all know, he died in jail and managed to escape his own trial. So there are still a lot of questions that we have about him and about his life. And that's partly why we're in the political moment that we're in, where everyone is calling for the release of these files.
Now, you were only one of 4 journalists to actually be in the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. And to recap this relationship, they were co-conspirators, the late Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, in what is being seen now as the biggest sex trafficking network in history that we know of at this stage. Ghislaine Maxwell is currently serving 20 years behind bars for her role in this on a number of conspiracy charges. You were in court for that trial. Can you tell us about the evidence?
Yeah, so the evidence that we heard at that trial was incredibly harrowing. We had a number of victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell give evidence about what they went through. And what we heard again and again was a story about how Jeffrey and Ghislaine worked together to identify victims. Often they would choose very vulnerable victims. And this is, a really important part of our conversation around grooming and child sexual abuse in general, is that these perpetrators will target children who have needs that aren't being met at home or in their lives. So they're financially vulnerable or emotionally vulnerable. So the two of them would choose their victims, and then Ghislaine would kind of take a primary role in grooming them, earning their trust, and then they would be sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein. And in some cases, we heard evidence that Ghislaine Maxwell was sexually abusing them as well. So, we heard evidence spanning more than a decade, and we heard this story again and again. And having spoken to members of the jury after that trial, everyone was in agreement that the evidence we heard was horrific. And it's really hard to overstate the severity of these crimes.
Lucia, Ghislaine was convicted of a number of conspiracy charges. And as we know, with a conspiracy, there are many people involved in this network. And there's been a lot of speculation and allegations about who was involved in this sex trafficking network, with allegations of incredibly powerful people from all different walks of life. You believe there were more people involved in this, especially because a conspiracy cannot involve one person, that being the late Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell.
Exactly right. So we find ourselves in a very strange and very troubling situation where the only thing that's been confirmed by the courts is that Ghislaine was a conspirator. As you say, Jeffrey is dead and was never convicted of the extent of his crimes. He was, of course, convicted of some of his crimes in 2007, 2008. But what we heard about at trial was a much bigger conspiracy and a much bigger sex trafficking ring. And so what we have is we have one person in jail for facilitating that ring, but we don't have anyone convicted for accessing that ring or being a client of Jeffrey Epstein in terms of the way that he would use underage girls. So that's very concerning because we know from the victims that there were other men involved in this. I mean, this is one of the things that's really troubling me at the moment, where everyone's kind of calling for the release of these files so that we can start looking into the other men. But we don't need any other files to start looking into the other men. There is enough on the public record to start investigating other people who are connected to this. Donald Trump is obviously one of them, and that's the focus of the political moment that we're in. But one of Jeffrey's victims filed a lawsuit and said under oath that she had been sexually assaulted by Trump and trafficked to him by Epstein. So that is already out there. That allegation should be enough to start a criminal investigation. So the problem here is not that we don't know whether there were other men or who they are. The victims have told us all of that. The problem is that there's no institutional will to investigate. And we've seen that for decades.
Lucia, why? The first question to you would be why? If we have this evidence, if we know who and I'm saying this carefully, the alleged perpetrators are, no matter how powerful or whom they are, why have they not been prosecuted?
It's a really good question, and it's one I think about a lot. So with a case like this, because so many of the alleged perpetrators or alleged enablers, and, let's remember that it is a crime to conspire with something like this, to know about something like this and to not do anything about it. So, we're not just talking about men that we believe to have actually committed sexual abuse. So there is at least one person who's made that allegation against Donald Trump specifically. But, in general, what I really want to know is not only who was accused of actual sexual abuse, but who knew and conspired and did nothing about it. So the reason I think there is no institutional will to investigate this is just because there are so many powerful people implicated in it. And it's, bipartisan. There are powerful people implicated from both major parties in the US. And unfortunately, the American justice system is very dependent on political will to get these kind of investigations off the ground. And then also we have, very high profile people in tech who are accused of being connected to this. And they, at the moment, have a lot of power with the federal government. So there are so many people in power who are close to this. And again, not saying that they sexually abused anybody, but know that they were close to him and connected to this in some way. And they don't want it to come out.
Talking about the victims, Lucia, and also the survivors, one of the ones that certainly I think many of us think was at the forefront of getting justice for survivors and victims was actually Virginia Giuffre, who for a long time, after getting married, lived in Australia. In regards to her story, and she made allegations against Prince Andrew that she was trafficked by Epstein and by Ghislaine Maxwell to Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew always denied those allegations, yet he did settle out of court with a civil lawsuit against Virginia Giuffre. Can you speak to us in how courageous she was and the secrets that she actually exposed at great loss to her?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that speaking up about any kind of sexual abuse is incredibly dangerous for those of us who've been through it. But, this story carries a different level of danger for victims and survivors who decide to fight for justice because they are up against incredibly powerful people and incredibly powerful institutions who don't want the truth about this to come out. So Virginia really had to fight very, very hard for many years to try and expose what happened here. And, she recently died by suicide. And that really shows just how unbearable it is, firstly, to live through sexual abuse as a child, but also to live in a world where nobody believes you and people would much rather believe the powerful people that you are accusing of criminality than to believe you. So, it's incredibly sad and heartbreaking, and it just shows how much better we need to be at supporting victims.
Do you think for her, though, considering what she had been through, she had seemed so incredibly brave, and now looking back, all of us are thinking the timing of what had happened to her and she passing away was just before, yet again, the pressure out of nowhere increased in this case?
Yeah, absolutely. And these things keep happening in this case. It is one of those cases where the truth is stranger than fiction. And it's really hard to overestimate how much power is involved in trying to cover this up. So, at every turn, we do have to be very, very aware of that. And we really have to keep investigating everything that happens.
That was journalist Lucia Osborne-Crowley. And in a special bonus episode of the Afternoon Briefing, we chat with Lucia again about what the real story is behind the Jeffrey Epstein scandal and why she believes Ghislaine will walk free from prison after a presidential pardon. Head to the briefing feed now and look for episode 383.